She made a promise to a dying woman she'd never met. 3 words whispered in a dim hospital room: "Take my baby." For 3 years, that child was hers. She learned to walk on her porch, spoke her first words in her kitchen, and became her entire world. But what she didn't know was the child's father was still alive, overseas, and completely unaware his daughter had survived. Until the morning, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to her gate, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, flanked by a phalanx of lawyers, to take back a daughter he'd never even held. Her name is Loretta. She's 67 years old. 3 years ago, she held a dying woman's hand and made a promise. Now that baby calls her mama, and the man who wants to take her is a stranger with a fleet of lawyers. He has the law, she has only the truth, and this is where their battle begins. The first time Loretta held the baby, she was still covered in her mother's blood. It was a Friday night in November at Chicago's Mercy Hospital. Loretta had been a maternity nurse there for 30 years, retired now, but she'd stopped by to drop off a casserole for the night shift. That's when she heard the screaming. A young woman, alone, no family, no partner, rushed in from the emergency room hemorrhaging. She'd gone into premature labor at 32 weeks. Her name was Maya. She was 24 years old, from a small town near Birmingham, Alabama, and she'd been living in a shelter for 2 months. Nobody on staff knew she existed until that night. Loretta held Maya's hand while the doctors tried to stop the bleeding. She held it through the emergency C-section. She held it when a tiny baby girl, barely 4 pounds, was lifted from a body that was already shutting down. Maya looked at Loretta through eyes that were already fatting. 3 words: "Take my baby." She didn't know Loretta's last name. They'd met 90 minutes earlier, but Maya had no one else, and she knew she had minutes left. Loretta, 64 at the time, a widow with grown children long moved away, said yes, not because she was prepared, not because she had a plan, because a dying woman asked, and there was no one else in the room to answer. Maya died 17 minutes later. The baby girl survived. The hospital tried to find next of kin. They checked the mother's ID, which was expired. They ran the name through every database. No immediate family, no father listed on any birth records, because Maya never filed one. She'd been homeless, moving from shelter to shelter, and she never gave the hospital a father's name. The baby was a Jane Doe. That's when the system should have kicked in. Foster care, state custody. Another child lost in a bureaucracy that swallows thousands every year in this country. Over 390,000 children in foster care at any given time, disproportionately black and brown. But that's not what happened. Because Loretta, retired, alone, with an empty house and a pension check and 30 years of knowing how a hospital works, stepped into the gap. She told the social worker she'd keep the baby temporarily, just while they searched for the father, just for a few weeks. The social worker, overworked and understaffed, agreed. They wrote it up as an emergency informal kinship placement. No judge, no court order, no legal custody, just a piece of paper and a promise. That temporary arrangement lasted 3 years. And during those 3 years, Loretta gave that child everything she had. She named her Grace because despite everything, the baby had survived. She fed her, clothed her, stayed up nights when Grace had asthma attacks. She taught her to walk on her porch, to say please and thank you, to sing "This Little Light of Mine" in a voice that cracked on the high notes. Grace called her Mama. She didn't know any other mother. And the entire time, Loretta never had legal custody. She had the child's birth certificate finally issued with only Maya's name. She had medical records, school enrollment, a paper trail of a life she'd built. But in the eyes of the law, Grace was still a ward of the state, and Loretta was just a temporary caregiver waiting for the real parents to show up. She didn't think they would. She prayed they wouldn't. But here's what she didn't know. 2,000 miles away, a man named Marcus Bell was stepping off a plane at O'Hare International Airport. Marcus was 38 years old, a former Army logistics officer who'd spent the last 4 years on private military contracts in Kuwait and Afghanistan. He'd been back in the country for 6 months, living in a condo in Phoenix, when he got a letter forwarded from an old address. It was from a private investigator hired by the hospital's legal department, one last attempt to locate the father before finalizing adoption paperwork. The letter said a woman named Maya had died 3 years ago, that she'd left behind a daughter, that the child was currently in informal care with a non-relative, and that if he wanted to assert parental rights, he had 90 days to respond. Marcus hadn't known Maya was pregnant. They dated for less than a year, ended things badly, and she disappeared. He didn't know about the baby. He didn't know about the birth. He didn't know about the death. And now he was learning all of it in a single letter. Marcus hired a lawyer within 24 hours, a law firm that specialized in parental rights cases, the kind of firm that charged $800 an hour and never lost. They filed an emergency petition for paternity, for custody, for immediate physical placement of the child. The argument was simple. Marcus was the biological father. His name was now on the birth certificate after a court-ordered DNA test, and under the 14th Amendment, a fit parent has a fundamental right to raise their own child. Loretta had no legal standing. She was a stranger, a kind stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. And on a Tuesday morning, when Grace was 3 years and 2 months old, the convoy arrived. A black SUV, then another, then a third. They parked on the street outside Loretta's small house on the south side. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase and a court order. Behind him, 4 attorneys, and somewhere behind them, still in the car, Marcus Bell sat waiting to meet a daughter he'd never held. The man in the suit handed Loretta the papers. Emergency petition for custody. Grace was still asleep inside. The hallway was quiet. And Loretta, 67 years old, with no lawyer and no rights, and nothing but 3 years of sleepless nights and hand-sewn dresses, and a promise she made to a dying woman, read the words that would change everything. The biological father asserts his superior right to custody. The caregiver is ordered to surrender the child within 72 hours, pending a final hearing. She looked up at the man, then at the cars, then at the face of a stranger in the back seat who was staring at her house like it had stolen something from him. And that's when Loretta realized the promise she made to Maya wasn't just going to cost her a child. It was going to cost her everything. 72 hours. That's how long the court gave Loretta to hand over the only child she'd ever called her own. She read the order standing on her porch in her housecoat, the morning sun barely clearing the rooftops, and for a long moment she couldn't breathe. Not couldn't, wouldn't, because breathing meant accepting what was written on that paper, and acceptance wasn't something she knew how to do. She'd been a nurse in this city for 3 decades. She'd watched families torn apart by paperwork they didn't understand, by judges who never looked up from their desks, by a legal system that treats poor people like problems to be processed. She'd seen it happen to others. She never thought it would happen to her. She folded the court order carefully, the way you fold something that might explode if handled wrong, and she walked back inside her house. Grace was still asleep in the back bedroom, the pink room with the butterfly decals Loretta had spent an entire weekend putting up. The room that had once been her son's decades ago. The room that was silent until Grace filled it with laughter and bad dreams and the 1,000 tiny noises of a child who finally feels safe. Loretta sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed Grace mashed bananas and cut toast into triangles and wiped away tears from skinned knees, and she made 3 phone calls. The first was to her son, Jerome, a public defender in Atlanta. He listened, then said the words she'd been dreading. "Mama, legally you don't have a leg to stand on. You're not blood, you never adopted her. The father has every right, I'm sorry." The second call was to a family friend who worked in the clerk's office at the Cook County Courthouse. She asked one question: who is the judge assigned to the Fairfax petition? The answer came back in 15 minutes. Judge Harold Thornton, a former corporate attorney with a reputation for ruling strictly by the letter of the law, no room for sentiment. The same judge who 3 years earlier had ruled against a grandmother in a nearly identical case, stating in his opinion that emotional bonds formed through informal care do not override the constitutional rights of a fit biological parent. That grandmother had lost. The child was returned to a father she hadn't seen in 4 years. Loretta knew about that case. Everyone in her community did, and now she had the same judge. The third call was to a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, an immigration attorney who'd once been a patient of Loretta's and owed her a favor. Patricia wasn't a family lawyer, but she knew someone who was. A young attorney named Elijah Cross who ran a small legal aid clinic on the west side. He took cases nobody else would touch. Cases involving grandparents, foster parents, kinship caregivers. Cases where the law was against you and the only weapon left was the truth. Patricia gave Loretta his number, said he was good, said he was hungry, said he'd never lost a case to a rich man's lawyer because he went for the throat every single time. Loretta called him, and that phone call changed the shape of the war that was coming, because Elijah didn't just listen to her story. He asked a question no one else had thought to ask. You said the father was overseas for years. Do you know what he was doing? Loretta told him what the investigator's letter said. Private military contracting, years in Kuwait and Afghanistan, a man who'd been gone so long he didn't know his own child existed. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm going to pull his file. Everything. Employment records, military contracts, passport stamps, any criminal history, any complaints, any red flags. If there's something in his past that makes him unfit, we need to know before that hearing. That hearing was scheduled for 14 days from today. 14 days to build a case that could keep Grace in the only home she'd ever known. 14 days to prove that a man who shared her blood had no right to raise her. And Elijah Cross spent the first 3 of those days unearthing secrets that Marcus Bell thought he'd buried on the other side of the world. The first thing he found was a name change. Marcus Bell wasn't born Marcus Bell. He was born Marcus DeWitt in Mobile, Alabama. He changed it legally at age 22, right before enlisting in the Army. The reason wasn't in the public record, but the timing was. A few months before the name change, a woman named Keisha DeWitt had filed a domestic violence complaint against a Marcus DeWitt in Mobile. The case was sealed. The charges were dropped, but the complaint existed. The second thing he found was a string of private military contracts, not just logistics, not just supply chain, as the letter had suggested. Marcus had worked for a contractor called Aegis Defense Solutions, a company that had been investigated twice by the Department of Justice for allegations of excessive force and civilian casualties in Afghanistan. Marcus's role was classified as security operations. That could mean anything. It could mean he drove trucks. It could mean he carried a weapon and made decisions about who lived and who died. The contract files didn't say, but the company's reputation did. The third thing Elijah found was a financial record, a series of wire transfers from an account in Marcus's name to an unregistered LLC in Nevada. The amounts were large, $140,000 over 18 months. The LLC was a shell company with no public officers, no listed address, no business license. It was the kind of entity people create when they don't want anyone to know where the money is going. Elijah sat in his cramped office, stacks of paper covering every surface, and he looked at the picture forming on his desk. A man with a violent complaint in his past, sealed but not erased. A man who'd worked for a contractor with blood on its hands. A man who'd moved large sums of money through a ghost company. None of this proved he was an unfit parent. None of it would automatically strip his parental rights, but it painted a picture. And in a custody hearing where the judge already leans toward the biological parent, the only way to win is to paint a picture so troubling, so complete, that the judge has no choice but to see the father as a risk. Meanwhile, Marcus Bell's legal team was moving fast. They'd filed a motion to expedite, arguing that every day Grace spent with a non-relative was a day of harm, that the child needed to be with her biological father immediately, that the caregiver had no standing to even be in court. They hired a child psychologist who'd already submitted an affidavit stating that delaying reunification causes long-term attachment damage. The same psychologist, it turned out, had testified in 16 previous cases, always on behalf of the parent who could afford her fee. Her rate was $400 an hour. Loretta was living on a pension check that barely covered her mortgage. She had no team, no expert witnesses, no money to fight a billionaire's army. She had Elijah Cross, a legal aid lawyer who took the bus because his car had been repossessed. She had a community that was beginning to hear her story. And she had the truth, whatever that was worth. On the 5th day before the hearing, Loretta got a phone call that turned everything sideways. It was from a woman who identified herself as Keisha, the same Keisha, the one who'd filed the complaint against Marcus 20 years ago. She'd heard about the custody case through a mutual acquaintance. She'd been watching the news, waiting to see if her name would come up. And now she was calling Loretta because she had something to say. "He's not who he says he is," Keisha said, her voice shaking. "And if you're going to fight him, you need to know what he's capable of." What she told Loretta next would become the linchpin of the entire case, something that had been buried for 2 decades, something that, if proven true, would change everything the judge thought he knew about Marcus Bell. And it was the one thing Marcus and his $800 an hour lawyers never saw coming. The thing Keisha told Loretta that morning scrambled everything they thought they knew about Marcus Bell. She didn't just describe a bad relationship gone wrong. She described a man who, when she was 23 years old and 8 months pregnant, had shoved her down a flight of stairs because she'd asked him to turn down the television. She lost the baby that night, a boy, nearly full term. She filed the police report from her hospital bed, and the officers took photos of the bruises on her arms, her back, the carpet burn on her elbows from where she'd tried to catch herself. The case was sealed less than a month later, not because it didn't happen, because Marcus's father, a retired Army colonel with connections in the Mobile District Attorney's office, made some phone calls. Keisha was 23, no lawyer, no family support. She took a settlement of $15,000 and signed a non-disclosure agreement. She never spoke about it publicly until now, but she kept the photos, she kept the medical records, and she kept a letter Marcus had written her from basic training 2 years before the stairs, where he wrote about his father hitting his mother, about how some women just needed to be put in their place. Keisha had saved everything in a shoebox under her bed for 2 decades, waiting for a moment when telling the truth might actually matter. This was that moment. Elijah Cross now had what every family court judge in Illinois is legally required to consider: credible evidence that the biological parent seeking custody had a documented history of violence, a history of causing the death of an unborn child, and a history of using money and family connections to bury the truth. This wasn't just a character flaw, this was a pattern, and if the judge accepted Keisha's testimony and her evidence, Marcus Bell could be deemed unfit, not an unfit partner, an unfit parent, and under the law that changes everything. The hearing was held in a family courtroom on the 4th floor of the Cook County Circuit Court. Judge Harold Thornton presided, gray-haired, stern, reading glasses low on his nose. Marcus Bell sat at the petitioner's table with 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than the furniture in the room. Across the aisle, Elijah Cross sat alone with a single file box and a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. Loretta sat in the gallery behind him, wearing her best church dress, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. She wasn't allowed to bring Grace. The court had ordered that the child remain in the temporary custody of a neutral third party until the ruling. The opening arguments went exactly as expected. Marcus's lead attorney, a woman named Claire Van Owen with silver hair and a voice like a scalpel, laid out the constitutional argument. A father, a fit father, a father who had never been convicted of any crime, who had served his country, who had stable employment and a home and a desire to raise his daughter, had a fundamental right to do so. The fact that an unrelated third party had cared for the child in his absence was generous, admirable even, but legally irrelevant. The law was clear. The law favored the parent. The law must be upheld. Elijah Cross stood up, and for a silent second, the only person in that courtroom who believed he could win was the woman in the 3rd row. He didn't start with the law. He started with the child. He described Grace. Her favorite foods, her bedtime rituals, her fear of thunderstorms, the song she sang when she was scared. He described the pink room with butterfly decals, the medical appointments Loretta had taken her to, the asthma attacks in the middle of the night, the first day of preschool when Grace had cried and Loretta had stayed in the hallway for 2 hours so she could see her through the window. He described a child who was not a case file, a child who was not a legal argument. A child who had already survived more loss than most people endure in a lifetime. Then he turned to the judge and asked one question. If Marcus Bell didn't even know this child existed 3 months ago, what has he done in his entire life to prepare to be her father? The judge listened. He didn't interrupt. And then Elijah called his first witness. Keisha DeWitt walked into that courtroom like a woman who had been waiting 20 years to be believed. She was 43 now, a high school English teacher in Birmingham, a mother of 2 teenagers, a woman with a steady voice and nothing left to lose. She took the stand. She was sworn in. And then, for the next 45 minutes, she told a story that made the room go completely silent. She told about the stairs, about the baby who didn't survive, about the police photos and the medical records and the envelope of cash delivered to her hospital room by a man she'd never seen before, along with a piece of paper that said if she signed it, she'd never have to worry about money again. She told about the phone calls Marcus made to her months later from basic training, not to apologize, but to threaten her, to tell her that if she ever spoke about what happened, he'd make sure no one believed her. She told about the letter, the one where he wrote about women needing to be put in their place. She had it with her. She handed it to the bailiff. The judge read it. His face didn't change, but he read it twice. Claire Van Owen cross-examined her aggressively, trying to paint her as a bitter ex-girlfriend with a vendetta, asking why she'd waited 20 years to come forward, why she'd taken the money if it was blood money, why anyone should believe her now. And Keisha looked her straight in the eye and said, "Because I was a scared kid who didn't have anyone to fight for me. That little girl in that house, she has someone fighting for her, and I won't let what happened to my son happen to another child." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Marcus Bell didn't look at Keisha, not once. He stared straight ahead at the judge's bench with an expression that was hard to read, not angry, not remorseful, something colder underneath. The judge called for a recess, 20 minutes. When he came back, he didn't rule on unfitness, not yet. He said he needed to review the evidence and he also wanted to hear from the father directly. Marcus took the stand. He denied everything. He said Keisha was lying. He said the settlement was to help her after a miscarriage, nothing more. He said the letter was taken out of context. His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of a man who had been trained to stay calm under pressure. But then Elijah asked him about his finances, the wire transfers, the shell company in Nevada, the $140,000. Marcus's composure cracked just slightly. He said it was a business investment. He couldn't name the business. He couldn't name a single person involved. He said his accountant handled it. The judge wrote something down. The hearing ended without a ruling. The judge said he would issue a written decision within 5 days. 5 days that felt like 5 years. And during those 5 days, something happened that nobody expected. Marcus's own lawyer, Claire Van Owen, filed a motion to withdraw as counsel. No reason was given, just the standard language about a breakdown in the attorney-client relationship. But everyone in that courthouse knew what it meant. Even Marcus's team was starting to see what Loretta already knew. The man who wanted to take Grace had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. And now, for the first time, someone was finally pulling back the curtain. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday. It was 9 pages long. He acknowledged the father's constitutional rights. He acknowledged the high burden required to deem a parent unfit. But then he wrote something that surprised even Elijah. The credible testimony of Ms. DeWitt, corroborated by contemporaneous police records, medical documentation, and the respondent's own written words, establishes a pattern of violence and deception that raises serious questions about the petitioner's fitness to parent a young child. These questions cannot be resolved by summary judgment. They must be resolved at trial. The emergency petition was denied. Grace would stay with Loretta, for now, but the war wasn't over. Marcus Bell had not given up. He had hired new lawyers, bigger ones, the kind who don't withdraw. The trial was set for 3 months away, and between now and then, everything would be on the line. Loretta would have to prove in open court that the man who shared Grace's blood had no right to raise her, and Marcus Bell would have 3 months to make sure that never happened. What neither of them knew was that the most explosive revelation of all was still waiting in the shadows. Something Keisha hadn't mentioned on the stand, something Elijah had found buried in military records that even Marcus didn't know existed. A piece of the story that would change the meaning of everything they just fought for. The file Elijah Cross found was stamped classified, but never fully sealed. It was a Department of Defense investigation into an incident that happened in Kandahar in 2012. Marcus Bell, then a private security contractor for Aegis Defense Solutions, had been involved in an altercation at a checkpoint. A civilian vehicle approached. The driver, an elderly Afghan man, did not understand the hand signals. Marcus opened fire. The man died on the scene. His 12-year-old granddaughter, sitting in the passenger seat, was struck by 2 bullets. She survived, but lost the use of her legs. The Army's initial report listed the shooting as justified. But the DoD investigation found that Marcus had violated rules of engagement, that he had fired before any warning shots, that witnesses described him as agitated, aggressive, and that he had been overheard earlier that day saying he was tired of these people not following orders. The investigation recommended disciplinary action. But before anything could happen, Aegis Defense Solutions terminated Marcus's contract quietly, flew him out of the country, and the file was buried in the depths of a database that only a Freedom of Information Act request could reach. It took Elijah Cross 18 months of digging through redacted records and calling former soldiers whose names appeared in footnotes to find someone willing to talk. A medic, now living in Ohio, who had been at the scene that day. He told Elijah that the Afghan girl's legs had been shattered because Marcus had aimed low, deliberately, to teach the driver a lesson. He said the girl cried for her grandfather until she passed out. He said he'd been carrying that image in his head for 12 years, and he was ready to testify. The trial lasted 6 weeks. It was covered by every local news station in Chicago and several national outlets. Two narratives collided in that courtroom. On one side, a biological father with a constitutional right to his child, represented by a law firm so powerful that its partners had argued before the Supreme Court. On the other, a 67-year-old grandmother with no legal claim and a stack of evidence that the father was a violent man who hid his past behind sealed records and shell companies. The emotional core of Loretta's case was Grace herself. The child psychologist hired by Marcus's own team had never interviewed Grace personally, but Elijah brought in a clinical psychologist who spent 12 hours with Loretta and the child in their home, observing their interactions. Her testimony filled an entire afternoon. She described a secure attachment, the kind that forms between a child and a caregiver whose every response communicates safety. She described a child who ran to Loretta when she was scared, who curled into her lap when she was tired, who called her mama with the easy confidence of a child who has never doubted that word means something. Then she said something that silenced even Marcus's lawyers. If you remove this child from that home, she will grieve. Not temporarily, not like a bad week that she'll bounce back from. She will grieve like a child who lost a parent, and the damage will follow her for the rest of her life. The judge took that statement into chambers. The next morning, he issued the ruling that ended the war. He found that Marcus Bell, while biologically related to Grace, was not a fit parent. The evidence of prior violence, the steps taken to conceal that violence, the lack of any meaningful relationship with the child, and the overwhelming evidence that Loretta Osse was the only mother Grace had ever known, all pointed in one direction. The child's best interest was not to be removed. The child's best interest was to stay right where she was. And then he did something that no one expected. He granted Loretta permanent legal guardianship of Grace, effective immediately, and he ordered Marcus to have no contact with the child for a period of 3 years, after which he could petition for supervised visitation only if he completed a court-ordered anger management program and a parenting course. It was not an adoption, but it was everything Loretta needed. The law finally saw what Grace had always known. As they walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, Grace holding Loretta's hand and singing something about butterflies, a woman approached. She was thin, her hair pulled back, and she carried a manila envelope that looked like it had been through a flood. She introduced herself as a records clerk from Mercy Hospital, the same hospital where Maya died. During a file room audit, she had found something that had been sitting in a box marked miscellaneous patient correspondence for nearly 4 years. It was a letter, handwritten, dated the morning before Maya gave birth, before anyone knew she was in labor. It was addressed to whom it may concern. In it, Maya wrote that if anything happened to her, she wanted her baby to be raised by the woman who had given her a blanket in the emergency room the night before. She didn't know her name, but she described her perfectly. She wore a nurse's badge from the maternity ward. She had gray hair and kind eyes, and she smelled like lavender. And she had told Maya, while wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, that everything was going to be okay. That nurse was Loretta. Maya had written Loretta into her will before she even knew her name. The letter had never been delivered. It had been filed wrong, forgotten, lost in the gears of a system that processes death faster than it processes love. But now, standing on the courthouse steps with the sun going down and Grace still singing beside her, Loretta held the letter in both hands. She didn't cry, not yet. She just looked at her granddaughter and realized that Maya's last request hadn't been a desperate plea to a stranger. It had been a gift, written in advance, to the only person who had shown her kindness in her final hours, and that kindness, 4 years later, had become the law. Loretta still lives in that same house on the south side. Grace is 7 now, in 2nd grade, learning to read chapter books and still singing the same song her grandmother taught her. The pink room with the butterflies still looks exactly the same, but something has changed. There's a piece of paper framed on the wall now. Not the court order, the letter, Maya's letter, written in a hospital bed before she knew she'd never hold her daughter, addressed to a woman whose name she didn't even know, but whose kindness she felt in the dark. That letter is now part of the legal record. A dead woman's words became the foundation on which a family was built and protected. But here's what keeps me up at night. In this country, over 2.5 million children are being raised by grandparents or other relatives. Many of them, like Grace, are in homes where the caregiver has no legal rights, no adoption decree, no guardianship order, just love and a promise, and the quiet terror that one day a piece of paper could destroy everything. There are Lorettas in every city, every neighborhood, every block. Women and men who stepped into a child's life when nobody else would, and are now fighting a system that treats them like strangers to the children they raised. Most of them don't win. Most of them never see a courtroom. Most of them just lose the child they love in silence. So I have two questions for you. Do you know someone raising a child without legal protection? Someone who needs to know that kinship care can become legal guardianship if you fight hard enough? And if you were asked to make a promise to a dying stranger, would you keep it, even when the whole world told you it wasn't yours to make? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that the law can be changed, that love counts for something, and that the invisible people who hold families together are finally being seen. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the people who refuse to be erased. Because sometimes a promise is stronger than a law, and sometimes it becomes one.